There's this quote that says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not stay the same." Tonight, we celebrate 10 years of the annual Heritage Fair. My name is Jennifer Slay, where I've called London home for 29 years. I can't even believe I can say that. Having counseled, spoken, and educated individuals with regards to multiculturalism for over 20 years, I was honored to be asked to be your moderator for tonight's event. For the past 10 years, Londoners have gathered together each February to launch Ontario Heritage Week with the London Heritage Fair. This year, due to COVID, Heritage Fair 2022 is online with a focus on a topic very applicable to our current lives: multiculturalism in London 50 years later. 2021 marked the 50th anniversary of the multicultural policy in Canada. Canada was the first country in the world to adopt multiculturalism as an official policy, intending to preserve the cultural freedom of all individuals and provide recognition of the cultural contributions of diverse ethnic groups to Canadian society. For many years following this initial action, multicultural policies did not meet all the needs of all immigrants to Canada, but the introduction of the term brings attention to the need for federal coordination to reflect the diversity of Canadian society. Hence, the panel discussion tonight will focus on one of the most socially transformative pieces of legislation in the history of Canada and will be called Multiculturalism in London 50 years later. The London Heritage Council, with support from the City of London's Culture Office, is pleased to present Multiculturalism in London 50 years later, an online panel featuring local experts who I'll introduce shortly. We want to start with an acknowledgement of the traditional lands we call our home. The City of London is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Ottawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We would also like to recognize and honor the long-standing relationships with the three First Nations communities neighboring the City of London: the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. In addition, one of our panelists is joining us from Kitchener, which is part of the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada and Haldimand treaties. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather here, albeit virtually this year. And we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years, wherever you are joining us from this evening. We encourage you to take some time to learn about the First Peoples of your region. Before we dive into the questions for our panelists, I'll be introducing each of them, reading a brief bio. And if you can wave when I call your name, that would be wonderful. First up, I'd like to welcome Valerian Marochko, Executive Director of the London Cross-Cultural Learner Center. Before joining the LCCLC, he worked as a consultant for institutions such as the Collège Royal, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Harvard Institute for International Development. Since 2009, he has led the LCCLC to become an effective multi-service organization focused on refugee resettlement and immigrant integration in Canada. His passion is advocating for humanitarian issues and creating inter-organizational structures that support the successful integration of newcomers. Welcome, Valerian. Next, I'd like to introduce Mojdeh Cox. Mojdeh believes in the power of collective compassion, creativity, and action to work towards solutions to complex social issues. With over 10 years of experience in social policy work and co-designing and executing political campaigns, Mojdeh is equipped with the analysis and practices needed in community-based leadership roles. She is dedicated to bringing people together to have challenging conversations around complex issues and develop action plans to effect change. Welcome, Mojdeh. You will also hear from Howard Ramos, professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at Western University. Howard is a political sociologist who investigates issues of social justice and equity. He has published works on social movements, human rights, indigenous mobilization, environmental advocacy, ethnicity, and race, and is currently working on projects looking at secondary cities, integration of immigrants and refugees, and hockey and multiculturalism. Welcome, Howard. And last but certainly not least, Shobhita Sharma. Shobhita is a communications professional with a passion for storytelling and community building. A public relations practitioner and a former multimedia journalist, Shobhita is now the manager of global marketing and communications for Skepa Industrial. A passionate Londoner, Shobhita is also involved with a number of causes in the community and holds a master's degree in journalism and a BA honors in media information and technoculture from Western University. Welcome, Shobhita. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for joining us this evening. We have some great questions for you tonight, and I expect we'll have some enlightening discussions. Attendees were encouraged to submit questions they have about multiculturalism in Canada 50 years later. For those at home, if you have questions that aren't answered by the panel, you can ask them in the comments on the live stream. We have someone monitoring them, and if we have time, we'll put them out to the panelists at the end. Kicking it off, we have a question for Mojdeh. Mojdeh, how has the approach of Canadian businesses and nonprofit organizations toward diversity and dismantling systemic barriers changed throughout your career?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. What an honor to be sharing the stage with so many remarkable panelists with an excellent host that I am excited to be working with this evening. That's an excellent question. Thank you for that question, whoever in the audience and in the community that asked this. You know, in the early 2000s, there was significant research emerging from, well, more emerging around newcomers, racialized people, people of color, and underrepresented groups not receiving equitable representation in the sector. And since then, Pillar has been working towards engaging in this work in a meaningful way. Today, we are actively working towards being an anti-racist and anti-oppressive organization through the way that we work internally as a team, as well as the way we engage in the community and sector through our learning and development programming or consulting programming through impact consulting, or even our public policy and advocacy and community building principles. As we have engaged in this work, we've seen an evolution that is unbelievable. You know, on a personal level, I was in this sphere before folks were paying for us to do this work, to get into organization, to bring and elevate equity issues. Since then, things have evolved. Establishing the moral imperative for diversity isn't necessarily, in building a business case for diversity, isn't necessarily where organizations are anymore. You know, this approach didn't center the harm and those who were harmed. And now businesses and other entities are thinking about equity beyond the business case, which is exciting. Realizing equity will drive organizational longevity and relevance in today's world. And through a risk management lens, it is better for businesses and entities as a whole to thrive and to do what's right. It isn't a matter of building up the business case anymore. Today, we aim to center that harm and assess our impact through different indicators to measure our evolution. Personally, from the Pillar nonprofit lens, we provide an opportunity to convene, or several opportunities to convene, to have unfiltered conversations as we aim to root harm and be radically accountable as well. So we're rooting radical accountability, a concept that compels us to engage in fearless honesty and setting intention and self-reflection and action through change behavior. This is integral to shifting systems because people are at the core of these very systems we want to dismantle. So removing the people is really quite dangerous if we're only looking at systems approach. I think both things can live, the individual analysis and reflection and the organizational and systems level work. People control systems, people benefit from systems, yet it's important to note that not all people benefit equally or at all. Some of the folks that we're speaking about here, it's important to note that the benefit disproportionately works against Black, Indigenous, people of color, the 2S LGBTQI plus community members, people living with disabilities, and all forms of intersecting social identifying and location markers for marginalized people. So I think we've come a long way, but we haven't come far enough. We see this in the context of what's happening in the world today by way of those occupations that are happening across the country as we speak, including our own capital. So I think one of the ways our 2021 strategic plan focuses on examining anti-racism and anti-oppression, and one of the ways the community can get involved is to come along that journey with us. We are looking at shifting inequitable systems. We're aiming at failing along the way because we know it's inevitably going to happen. This type of change doesn't happen without slipping a little bit. So we're noticing there's a little, maybe less forgiveness, but more tolerance for mistakes, and it's necessary to slip up along the way. So we've seen some shifts. Sorry for taking up so much space for that. It's a fulsome, we can have an hour-long conversation about this shift, but I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists as well to build on this.
Thank you so much, Mojdeh. Thank you. Over to you, Valerian. How have you seen London's approach to multiculturalism change over the past 50 years?
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to be here tonight with you and the distinguished panelists. I came to London over 20 years ago, and the organization has been around over 50 years. And its history kind of reflects of the history of multiculturalism in Canada. Cross-Cultural Learner Center was created with the purpose of bringing people and resources together in an atmosphere in which individual and group from across community can understand the issues of international development, cross-cultural issues, and act together to create a more welcoming community, both globally and locally. So currently our mission is to provide integration services and support to newcomers and to promote intercultural awareness and understanding. We feel that the push toward multiculturalism since it started 50 years ago has in large part assisted in the integration of immigrants and minorities in our community. There's multiculturalism policy and is also the multicultural competencies development. And our organization has played an important role. More recently, almost a decade ago, started with support from Western Center for Research in Ethnic Relations and Migration, Intercultural Competency Training Program. Now it's under a great home, under the umbrella of Employ and Will Employment Connections. And this is where it is necessary to also offer that type of skills development to businesses, to all the organizations, all the workplaces. And we know the result because Canada has been encouraging that integration and welcoming immigrants. Research shows that the children of immigrants have better educational outcomes in Canada than and workforce also than in other Western democracies. We think that the fact that Canada brings in a large amount of highly skilled immigrants and human capital and creating support for them, for the immigrants, it helps to create a more welcoming community. And the resources are there. Businesses need workers, need managers. I'm looking at London. Some of the people 20 years ago, they were coming from Colombia or from other countries, and now they're management position in corporations, in public organizations. Their children are doing very well. So I've seen this also from my personal and very pleased. I went to study in a business school, and 20 years ago, there were no talk about corporate social responsibility and EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. And this is the language they talk in the business schools. And it has been known that Canadian executives, for example, do very well in multinational corporations because they could manage across cultures. So I think it's a whole of society, and we have to find the pockets where some more multicultural competencies are needed to be developed. It has to start in school and work on training, work on being more welcoming to everyone.
Thank you, Valerian. You know, just over the last 29 years of living in London, just looking at the landscape of London, it has changed so much. So you're absolutely correct. This question is for Howard. In the past few years, the focus of the discussion around multiculturalism has shifted from diversity to equity. What is the difference, and how has this change impacted London's cultural landscape?
That's a fantastic question, and thank you to the London Heritage Council and the panelists and everybody who's logged in for coming tonight and this opportunity to engage some of these issues. I think that Mojdeh began to answer a little bit of this question already, so I'm going to kind of follow through what she's already begun by saying that it's really important to begin looking at the origins of official multiculturalism in Canada. And when we look at the origins in the 1970s and 71, as we began to have a policy, it was a policy that came after biculturalism. And it was a policy that was trying to create a toehold in Canada to recognize that we are not a melting pot in the same way as the United States, and that we have diversity. At that time, it was much more ethnic diversity and religious diversity than the type of range of diversity that we have today. At the same time, it's important to recognize that in 1988, when the official Multiculturalism Act came into place, that it was a recognition that there were already some obstacles to the success that people were having, and that there was a need for some mechanisms to make sure that everybody does get ahead and gets to live the Canadian dream. And when people look at it, so a concept from sociology is the vertical mosaic. So we may not have been a melting pot, but we were a stacked mosaic. Years later, in the 1990s, people recast that mosaic and recognized it wasn't just a mosaic based on ethnicity, but also racialization and other intersections, which is where we get to begin to think about where we're at today. And when we look at some of the profound demographic shifts in the country, we're now not only talking about newcomer children, we're talking about the children of newcomers. And in places like Nova Scotia, 6th or 8th generation Canadians who come from backgrounds that are not the dominant backgrounds, or even here in Ontario, where we have folks who will have traced their ancestors back to the 1800s. And those folks are not having the same successes as the children of newcomers. And in fact, we find that in the 2nd and 3rd generation, there's been some downward mobility, and we have systemic issues in the country that the Multiculturalism Act was brought in to address. And I think that we begin to see a shift in understanding that we need to really ensure that our institutions address the root problems of systemic discrimination, and that the way to do that is to really focus on the issue of equity, which is to make sure that everybody has a fair shot. And we also begin to see work around anti-racism, which is calling out the blockage points. If you look at African Canadians of 3rd or 4th generation, or for that matter, Filipino Canadians, and I could go through a whole list of other Canadians who are not having the same opportunities systemically, we begin to realize that we need to call things for what they are, which is racism, and that we need to really focus on the true way to achieve equity, and give people a fair shot? So this is a great question. I could go on for an hour or more, so I'm going to try and wrap it up there and go to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Definitely, each of these questions, we could have a full hour discussion on each of them, but thank you so much. Shobhita, you've been heavily involved with diversity and inclusion initiatives, both in the corporate and in the not-for-profit world. How do the two worlds differ in their approach to multiculturalism?
Thank you. I'm going to flip the question, and I'm going to say I'm going to talk about where are these worlds, where are the similarities? And for me, and I can only speak from personal experience, the similarities are where diversity and inclusion have actually become a part of the conversation in both the not-for-profit sector as well as the corporate sector. It's in fact, diversity and inclusion now have become table stakes, where many organizations have now had either employee groups or employee resource networks that are dedicated to actually shifting the conversation from just inclusion to actually talking about anti-oppression and anti-racism, and how that starts from within, but also how is it reflected within the community. And for me, the most important part about this whole conversation, specifically in scenarios like corporates and like not-for-profit sectors or not-for-profit organizations, is where leadership comes in, and whether the leadership talks the talk and walks the walk. And that's where we see the most impact, where C-suite is also involved in these conversations. And in fact, the conversations are leading to concrete actions and not just remaining action items and checkbox to tick off for your performance review or whatever that might be. So there's a real need for action, and organizations, not just in London, but I think around Canada, are recognizing it as an important part of being a part of the community that you work, play, and live in.
Thank you so much. You know, the last couple of years have really shone a light on things, and things have certainly started to shift and change. We definitely have seen that. Thank you so much. Valerian, how has the push towards multiculturalism and equitable business practices changed the way businesses operate?
Just an observation to start. When I came over 20 years ago to London, the businesses were not as diverse. I'm talking about small businesses, which are big employer in Canada, and the biggest actually. What type of restaurants you can go to, what type of store, what type of clothing, you know, what we dress, what we eat. And we see also the consumer, so to speak, on the street. It's a much more diverse world in London, Ontario, that not necessarily was there 20 years ago. And some of these businesses that were started by newcomers, they're very, very successful. Other business partners, they had to learn to do business with them. And on the other side, it is, as I mentioned before, the need for workers, for the workforce, and in all type of positions, from you know, labor to mid-management to senior management level. There is a need for talent, and Canada has been bringing through the immigration, the skilled immigrants stream, some of that talent is growing up. We are looking at the many Syrian children who are still in school, and they're gonna graduate. Some of them, they already graduated. Some of them will graduate, and will be replenishing the demographic gap that has Canada. Businesses who pay attention to the demographic shifts will succeed. Those who don't will face difficulties, and that comes not only by paying lip service. People know where the environment, the work environment is welcoming and where it's not. And they don't stay where it's not. So retention, as like equity, diversity, and inclusion at the corporate level has to go to focus on retaining immigrants. And sometimes, there are misunderstandings, cultural oddities, and things like that, that if they're not properly communicated, and we have specialists like Shobhita in communications that could really help. And I think businesses who invest in integrating new cultures, because we didn't expect, let's say, to have Pashto-speaking Afghan refugees coming to London like 3 years ago. We didn't think about that, but it's happening now. We don't know where are the people who will be coming and interested to be in Canada 5 years from now. So like the cultures change. So it's not just being good with one culture, having that intercultural competency, working across cultures, because there's so many cultures, and it's a richness that is very important. And also, if you look at the businesses, it's a buying power of multicultural communities, and that's something that is important for the bottom line ultimately.
Yeah, you're so right. I read an article a little while ago that stated that the more diverse organizations, diverse in ethnicity, in age, in gender, are the ones that are most successful. So thank you very much for your comments. Shobhita, back to you.
Hello.
Hello. You have extensive experience in journalism and media. In your opinion, how has modern media in London worked to promote multiculturalism?
So thank you for this question. And I was thinking about it, and and going back to Valerian's point, actually, the face of London is changing. And I moved to Canada 18 years ago, and even in the past 18 years, London has become more diverse. London stories have changed. People who these stories are about have changed. So it's very important that media recognize that. And I think that London media actually does a good job in telling those stories. But what will be really, really cool is to be able to see that diversity reflected in the people who are telling these stories too, because whose stories get told, how they get told, and who tells them really impacts what the audience sees and what the audience hears. So I think, and we've seen this time and again, like it's not just about covering multicultural festivals in London. We know that happens. Like we do a good job in covering celebrations, but I've seen, and especially over the past, say 5 years, I've seen our media dig into different cultures and groups and actually tell deep-seated stories, which is really great. But I would love to see more diversity reflected within our media as well, within those people who are telling those stories, because it's just so important. And honestly, like we have a great program at Western that is still training journalists. I am a graduate of the same program. Fanshot is the same as well. And it would be so nice, and it's so encouraging to see yourself reflected in the industry that you want to work in. And I think overall in Canada in general, we're getting there. We're not there yet, but definitely in London, I think it would be fantastic to see some more diversity in our media. But as far as telling those stories goes, I think we're doing a good job. I think we're doing a good job. We need to keep doing this. We need to keep telling those stories. We need to keep telling these new interesting stories about people who are calling London their home, who are choosing to call London their home. And we're so lucky for that.
Thank you so much. When children see themselves in different places, then there's something subconsciously happens that they believe that they can actually go and do that, right? So you're absolutely right. Thank you. Howard, we know you're currently working on a project on the integration of hockey and multiculturalism. Now, given that hockey is so ingrained with Canadian culture, how can it be used to promote multiculturalism?
Oh, I'm so happy to get a question on this. It's you know, any professor loves to get a question on the research they're doing. And this is a project that I'm doing with Lloyd Wong from University of Calgary. And I think it's, when we got into this research, what we really wanted to tackle is some of the stuff that Valerian and Shobhita have been talking about, which is how do we create inclusion and how do we create spaces of understanding? And so people often talk about social capital or cultural capital. And if you're unfamiliar with those terms, if you think of money as capital and you can trade it, well, social capital or cultural capital is, well, you have some understanding of something that you can trade. And so what's really important to have in a community is common points of understanding, and culture is a way to foster that. And if you look at Canada, arguably, even Heritage Canada had a leaflet out for newcomers saying that if you want to break ice with people, hockey. If you look at citizenship ceremonies across Canada, they often happen in hockey arenas. And so we set out to find out whether or not hockey and hockey arenas were multicultural common spaces where we can foster common understandings and humility. And in our research, what we found is that they are and they aren't. And there's a bit of an assumption that somehow we just magically know hockey. You know, sure, we might tune into the Olympics and watch the Canadian women win the gold medal, as we may have done last night. But the rules of the game aren't known to folks. Even just the basic things around the arena. You know, we were talking to one newcomer who was saying, you know, hang on a second. You know, when I first came to the arena, I thought everybody knew each other. And it turned out, no, they actually didn't know each other. They only got to know each other through things like raffles and cake or bake drives and stuff like that. And so there's a huge potential to include people, but unfortunately the sport's also been quite exclusionary. You know, one could look to the Don Cherry incident a few years ago, where he specifically targeted newcomers, or one can just look a few weeks ago in PEI where a poor kid had a racial slur thrown at them. And you know, what's interesting is as we talk to coaches and players, it's pretty clear that one doesn't win a hockey game. Last time I checked, you win a hockey game by putting the puck in the net, not calling somebody names. And so we really began to investigate, well, what's going on? And we found that there's a huge opportunity for us to recognize that the sport can be one of those common places. It can be a place to build cultural understanding, cultural humility, and that the answers to fixing the game are really within the game, which is there are a lot of good ethics within hockey, of team play, of camaraderie, of humility. And in my mind, cultural humility is something we all need. Competence is something that's a check mark. Unfortunately, you know, with most tests, I failed my check marks. But humility is just an openness to understanding. And so this is part of what the project's looking at, and recognizing that if we're truly going to have a national sport and a national game, it has to be one that includes everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Howard. That would be an interesting study to read about when it's all done. Mojdeh, you have our final question, or at least the planned questions. You've done a lot of work in elevating advocacy campaigns. How can Londoners get involved with these campaigns? And do you have any advice for anyone wanting to start their own campaign?
Another excellent question. I have to say, I started my advocacy work out of the need for survival and advocacy and sense of agency for myself first. I came to Canada 33 years ago, to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So those were really different times and a different place. So first and foremost, I think advocacy is such a broad term that can encompass a variety of ways to influence political and social change. It can be anything from educating the public to lobbying or media relations, as Shobhita is showing us, joining a group or organizing a protest. When people hear the word advocacy, one common area that may come to mind is public policy or government relations, and that's pretty powerful too. And even within that work, there are multiple ways for individuals and organizations to get engaged. We can think of engagement in public policy work or advocacy broadly, like a ladder where people and groups can engage at the levels that align with their capacity, their political experience, and will. And this may look like starting off with learning and seeking out information on the topics that one cares about. Then it may look like starting or following an organization rather that they're aligned with, or signing up for an email or following something on social media. And then it could progress to things like endorsing issues and messages, to collaborating, to independently advocating. And then at the top of this ladder would be people and organizations that you're collaborating with to lead on public policy and advocacy campaigns. One piece of advice that I want for anyone that's wanting to get engaged is to start by educating yourselves and seek out organizations or people who are already doing this work to find ways to plug in. There's no benefit in reinventing the wheel or going through the same iterations of things that perhaps didn't work. Whether it's working for an organization doing the work or volunteering or joining a committee, I would start at whatever it is that you feel drives your passion. Seek opportunities that amplify your skills or skills that you want to develop in order to tackle an issue. And take small steps. If you're aiming to be an ally, establish trust with integrity. Trust isn't built on these grand gestures, despite what many can think about that. That gesture, the grand gesture, often centers the gesturing and little benefit to those oppressed and impacted by the issues we're wishing to tackle. So I would also say to stay committed, because changing and influencing change and transformation, unfortunately, takes a great deal of time. And we have to think about our impact in incremental steps. I think lastly, there's so much to learn from grassroots organizations. I credit much of my learning and continued learning to grassroots organizations through their tactics and their way of advocacy, and distinctly, actually, through their organizing specialty. And when I say grassroots organizations, these are people formed really close, in touch with the issue, what the problem is. I think we have to hold space for one another, because I think both institutional advocacy can live at the same time as grassroots activism, and it must. Holding space for one another is essential. There's power in numbers. We have to let go of this either or mentality, or one way or the highway state of advocacy that often divides so many people wanting to do good. Each and every one of us have the power and ability to contribute to positive and sustainable and equitable transformation. And we can begin with the fundamentals of radical accountability, as I mentioned earlier. And, I would leave you with one quote that inspires me to this day, every single day, by author and activist Ijeoma Oluwo. When we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change. And so there's some things that we have to do in order to be able to do that. And that's to explore your why, learn about the issues you care about through the lens of those who are impacted, call things what they are. This language and trading off of jargon in the sector is overwhelming, and it's co-opting, and it's often inefficient and ineffective. So call things what they are. Today, what is needed based on what's happening out there is that we have to address systemic dominant cultures upholding oppression across all areas of our work lives, personal lives, economic situations, to the way that we interpersonally exchange. We have to name that. call it what it is. And right now, I think most importantly, to uplift and really push forward an agenda that's going to support multiculturalism in a way that doesn't harm people is by dismantling white dominant culture that we know is at the root of much of what we are battling with. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mojdeh. Those conversations can be tough, but they definitely are necessary. So we request that all the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and they will come to our panelists. I have a question here from one of our guests. How does the panel feel the pandemic has affected progress on moving towards a more multicultural society? And I'm going to request that each person answer that question. And I will start based on my screen here. Howard, would you like to start?
Oh, for sure. I think that that's a really difficult question to answer. And when we look at the last 2 years in London, we can certainly see we have had setbacks. I think that one of the things that's hard to separate, though, is how much of it is driven by the pandemic and how much of it is driven by the emergence of social media and the silos and the algorithms that create, rather than common spaces, siloed spaces. And it's very easy to have cascading and reinforcing messages. And I think that as that intersects with the pandemic, we find as we're doing this event right now on Zoom, we're spending more time in front of our screens and less time going to restaurants, having events together, playing some hockey together, where we get to break down some of those barriers and begin to sort of understand each other. So I think that the pandemic alone is not what's created setbacks. It's this kind of interaction with social media and a heightened anxiety that comes with economic setback and different policies around the virus and just the amount of screen time we had. So that's a few of my quick insights.
Thank you. Shobhita?
So obviously, very quickly, I think what the pandemic has actually done is that it's taken the veil off of those very difficult conversations that we were not having as a society. It's brought that to the surface. It's brought the inequality in our society to the forefront. We're forced to talk about it because we know, like, the rhetoric has changed from we're all in the same boat to we're not in the same boat, we're in the same storm. You're on a yacht, I'm probably on a lifeboat that's probably about to sink. So I think what's happened is that we are now forced to look at those things that we were willing to sweep under the rug and go on and think that everything was fine. It's not. And that just didn't just happen in London. I think this was a worldwide phenomenon where, starting with things that happened in the US in 2020 with George Floyd, with the graves being found or in Canada, things came to the forefront that we were forced to talk about. And I think it's a good thing because we were not, I mean, there were conversations, but there were whispers, and now they're not whispers. They're right here, right in front of us, and probably will help us move forward together stronger. And just to go back to Mojdeh's point, I think what's happening right now in Ottawa is also very, very indicative of what we were what was kind of in the background, but is now in the foreground, and we're forced to talk about it. We're forced to call it what it is now.
Yeah, if anything, the pandemic has forced us to not only look, but to listen. There's
Absolutely.
just really hasn't been a choice. Thank you so much. Mojdeh.
What an interesting question. I'm as I mentioned, first generation immigrant, and I can certainly say that the pandemic has had an incredible impact on global migration patterns for very obvious reasons. I think I read somewhere the other day that Today, there are almost 1 billion migrants worldwide. And of these, it was nearly 300 million have crossed international borders. There's been disruption, of course, in migration flows, I would imagine, and it's super complex and multi-dimensional the way that it has impacted those patterns. Those wishing to travel internationally simply couldn't. And so that really heightens harm for those before even reaching our borders. And yet, Canada still actively participates in immigration holding and detention centers. So when they arrive, there are also some, depending on status, are forced into these deplorable conditions as though there is a level of criminality to that migration, despite us understanding that there's a forced global migration that people cannot control. And I know that our colleague Valerian on this panel serves these folks each and every single day who are compelled to come to the country for all sorts of different reasons. So I think, back to the question of, how do we work towards being more multicultural as a society? I think there's a couple of myths that we have to debunk. Not everyone comes for a better life. Some people are coming because they're forced, and some people do achieve better and heightened status. My story was not that. My quality of life decreased exponentially because of systemic barriers, and hence why 33 years later, I'm doing this work each and every single day. So we have to do a couple of things. We have to be an inviting space. We have to recognize foreign accreditation, what we call foreign accreditation. People are coming really skilled. The most skilled and educated population are, in fact, immigrants in Canada. And so how are we not using those skill sets in good use? Migrants aren't going to call home and say, come here, if they are unable to make ends meet. So we have to make Canada a livable space, not just by ways of basic standards, but with dignity, so that folks can thrive and exchange an economy and have fulfilled lives where they can feel like they can belong, where they can go for a walk without being harmed. And so, or in worst case scenario, killed. It's tough. So we have to celebrate what we've been able to achieve and build on over the years. I really appreciated Howard's and both Valerian's sort of history of what immigration and migration look like, multiculturalism look like in Canada. It's important to understand that history and put a pin on some of the victories and milestones along the way. It's also really important to name what we must continue to do to ensure that people are living with dignity here, because ultimately people will come and we will be able to keep folks if we treat them well.
Thank you, Mojdeh. And Valerian.
Just to add to what my fellow panelists said, the pandemic exposed, what we are, who we are, who are the essential workers. What happens that we have so many people who came with medical qualifications and cannot work while we have a health crisis in the country. And I hope this will not be forgotten and follow on the advocacy and we have the proof. And it is very important just to not to forget what happened.
Thank you. We have a question from Paul to Shobhita. It says, I wonder if you see specific opportunities in London's news and media ecosystem for that greater diversity on the storyteller side. How much is it the responsibility of existing media outlets to make opportunities for this?
Thank you for that question, Paul. Extremely complex question, mostly because the media sphere is changing, in that back in the golden age of media, there were reporters dedicated to specific beats. People had a specific beat and would cover those stories. Newsrooms are shrinking, not just in London, but around the world, actually, not just in Canada either. And I can appreciate what my former colleagues are going through, where they're going from a story in education to another story in maybe a business story. I don't know what the day-to-day looks like, but how wonderful would it be to be in a space where not just where there is maybe just a section on specifically covering and sharing those multicultural stories from different parts of London, from different groups in London. How wonderful would it be to celebrate not just when something specific happens, but every day, but celebrate those multicultural or those cultures that make up the culture of our community every single day. But and then knowing the face of media right now, the reality that the business operates in, I can appreciate that there might not be one person who might be able to do that. It would be so good if we did have that, though. I hope that answers your question, Paul. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Shobhita. This question is from Abby, and it is to anyone who would like to answer. Do you think a new immigrant coming to Canada faces more or less challenges than ever before? For example, finding work or finding a place to live?
There's one challenge that has been increasing over the last years, and it is housing. It's unaffordable for most of the immigrants, and having a roof over your head is the key to do other things, the basic need, the basic housing need. And we could talk about the housing stock, about the affordability that is not there because of the increase in rent. We could talk about need to educate landlords that a newcomer comes, if it's supported, let's say by the government or by private sponsors, they do, they cannot request a credit check, but changing a little bit the thinking, and newcomers face barriers. Sometimes also we've seen racism, we've seen all kind of obstacles in finding housing, and it is key to. It's a loss for the society, because the sooner newcomers find housing, and the sooner they become more productive, more integrated, and the less support for less need for support, because they become self-reliant.
Yes. Was there anyone else that wanted to answer that question? Thank you, Valerian. Howard.
A couple of things that I would add is, I don't think that, what I would maybe stress is there are different challenges. And I think that housing and affordability are challenges that everybody's facing. But I think that what's really changed with the newcomers is just how many pathways people come to Canada now. It's hard to keep it all straight. I think there's over 50 different pathways that somebody can migrate to Canada. And in some senses, there's been some gains of going from the express entry system, for example, that does a better matching of people to jobs. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have more temporary foreign workers and people who have precarious status. So although Canada's bringing in 400,000 newcomers that get permanent residence, we also bring in another 400,000 people that have more precarious status. And then we can go and look at refugees, and we can look at all the other variants of pathways. And I think that that's what makes it different challenges. Whereas at the beginning of the Multiculturalism Act 50 years ago, the system was less complex, and the challenges were just very different as Canada was becoming new to a points-based system. And now I think that there's so many different systems of immigration that it's hard to give a single answer.
Thank you, Howard, for that. Another question for Dr. Howard. Do you think that there are structural inequalities for immigrants here in London? How could such inequalities be addressed to ensure equity for all? And this question is coming from Merita.
Well, I'll offer some thoughts and hope that others can add, because I think that folks have more experience in London than I do, especially with newcomer settlement. I think that there are a number of barriers. I think Valerian mentioned some of them. I think that anytime somebody moves to a new context, it's a bit of an uphill battle, just in the process of moving. And I'm not sure that Canada recognizes the sacrifice people make at labor disruption, at how long it takes to get to know just the basic things of where to get groceries, how do things work. And I think that those are barriers that are hard for people to overcome. And I think that we don't do enough just naming and recognizing that and being honest about it. So I would say that that's probably one of the first things to do, but I might kind of duck and hide on this one and pass it to some other folks as well who can offer more insights.
Valerian, I see you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to respond?
Yes, I would add, is that loss of networks. And, you know, a great way for anyone who's in the audience, volunteer to be part of the match program. It's called Canada Connect. It matches a newcomer family with a family who came maybe a long time ago or been Canadian for a while. Take them to a hockey game. That's where the cultural integration happens, particularly in Canada. Do a picnic together. If you know, if a family with children is matched with another family with children, children tend to get to learn from each other so much, and it's beneficial for everyone. But those networks, those lacks of network, although you know we could have virtual networks, people have networks back home, or you know, friends who our family members who are in Western Europe or the United States or Australia or so, it's still so they come from a position of like everybody who has a social network around is privileged just by being born Canadian and not being a newcomer. Also, people struggle to learn the culture. So we have to be patient, it takes a while to learn the Canadian culture and to understand it, and then people. I personally don't know when I became Canadian. I'm asking myself the question, but I know for sure that I am somehow in the process. So it is those individual aspects, but it's also related to you know, the opportunities. People not necessarily know about the opportunities, and perhaps even going back to those networks, those could inform better newcomers. You know, everyone who lives in London about opportunities. Newcomers have they have a great need for support, you know, from organizations that provide settlement services and from the public in general. So you know, having an open mind and connecting and volunteering to help newcomers is a great way to you know, erase some of that type of inequalities upon arrival.
Thank you. Mojdeh?
Thank you. I won't take much time, and I have to say, I still remember my host family, folks. It is such a valuable experience on both ends. 33 years later, I remember they consoled me. They, yeah, there was such a source of comfort that family in 1988 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. All that to say, I have to say that the answer to this question, yes, inequities around structural inequities for immigrants are alive and well. Xenophobia is a integral part of our systems in Canada at large and in London. And it plays out by way of, I mentioned earlier, not recognizing your accreditation and work experience and experience overseas. It appears in the way that we set up even the pathway to citizenship by way of those multiple streams of entry points, there aren't always pathways to stay. We've become really hyper nationalistic, and we see that through the occupations in Canada, across Canada today. So there are ways that we can address that, and I truly believe it starts with that radical accountability of the self, changing your own heart and mind, so that when you go to work, you understand that you're an integral part of a system, that you're in fact upholding. Each and every single one of us go to some establishment and uphold the systems that are holding back so many people in harmful ways. I don't know if we can connect those dots unless we change our own hearts and minds and build on empathy, so that we can take the perspective of the young Syrian family coming to Canada after years of experience where they come from and not be able to utilize that and live off of government social supports that aren't adequate for dignified living, and then have to send their children into systems like schools where they may be hyper-policed based on the level of poverty they experience or the lack of cultural coordination with what we deem appropriate here. So, there's so many layers of complexity to the experience of immigrants and migrants of all sorts. It starts with the very individuals that go to work every day and contribute to those systems that are making living here harmful.
Thank you so much. Now I'm looking at the time, and I know that we've gone over a little bit, but all of these responses have been wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise. And of course, thank you to everyone who has tuned in. The London Heritage Council would also like to thank the City of London's Culture Office for their support in this event. Please stay safe, and we hope to see you in person next year at the 11th Annual Heritage Fair. And I leave you with this quote from the great Nelson Mandela. "My dream would be a multicultural society, one that is diverse and where every man, woman, and child are treated equally. I dream of a world where all people of all races work together in harmony." Thank you and have a wonderful evening.